So who is right? Israel or the Palestinians? Who has the rightful claim to that piece of land? Because you hear one party come up with a set of arguments and the other party come up with a different set of arguments. So what is it? Well, the answer is not simple, and I want to take a broader approach than just the Israel-Palestine conflict. So let's dive into this. We live in a world where social media, identity politics, and geopolitics converge in heated debates, raising a fundamental question. How is it that different people can experience reality so differently? Are some people simply seeing the world wrong? Or are they dumb? Or can multiple realities be true at the same time? And what does it mean for our understanding of truth that every observer has their own interpretive framework? When we look at the world as a system of layered perspectives shaped by context, history, psychological development, and collective experiences, a different way of thinking emerges. Not in binary terms of right and wrong, but integral. And by integral, I mean taking multiple perspectives into account simultaneously, recognizing that each perspective reveals something and hides something, and the truth unfolds only in the interaction between those perspectives. For many people, this is difficult to see. Most are stuck in their own perspectives and rarely have access to a meta perspective where multiple viewpoints can be experienced simultaneously. This makes it hard to acknowledge that different perspectives can each contain a kernel of truth. Hence my central question: how can multiple, even clashing perspectives be true at the same time? And how can we as individuals and also as a society engage productively with them? Crucially, this requires avoiding endless relativism, where every perspective is morally equal, and instead cultivating a stance of openness, recognizing, examining, and differentiating perspectives without automatically prioritizing your own beliefs. Returning to the conflict between Israel and Gaza, for many Israelis, this conflict symbolizes survival, security, and self-protection in a hostile region. Every attack feels like confirmation of existential threat, a threat that generations of Jews have endured and passed down as intergenerational trauma. For many Palestinians, on the other hand, the same conflict represents oppression, loss of land and freedom, and daily life under occupation. At first glance, these perspectives seem completely opposed, as if you must choose one over the other. But this apparent opposition dissolves once we recognize that both perspectives are rooted in history and valid collective experiences. The Israeli existential fear is real. The Palestinian sense of injustice is real too. The challenge then becomes, can you take the other perspective seriously without immediately abandoning your own? This does not mean equating all perspectives morally, but rather acknowledging that something experienced as true by one side, based on their history and experiences, can also be true, even if it challenges your own convictions. So let's start with a fundamental question. What is a perspective? Well, a perspective is a way of looking at reality, a lens that emphasizes certain aspects while pushing others into the background. There is no neutral window through which reality can be seen directly and objectively. Trying to view reality without bias, it's itself a perspective. Every perspective reveals something, but also hides something, making it always partial. The idea that truth depends on perspective is not a modern discovery, though. As far back as ancient times, philosophers were grappling with these ideas. First off, you have Anaximander, a 6th century BCE Greek philosopher. He argued that reality cannot be reduced to a single absolute principle. Everything exists within a greater elusive whole, which he called the apeiron, literally the boundless or the indefinite. Heraclitus, another Greek philosopher around 500 BCE, claimed that there was no static truth. Reality is constantly in motion, and opposites are inherent to it. Protagoras, another philosopher, went further, stating that man is the measure of all things. What is true depends on who perceives it. Here, the beginning of the modern concept of perspective starts to take shape. Centuries later, Michel de Montaigne emphasized that our beliefs are always colored by culture and time. And Nietzsche expanded this into perspectivism. There is no truth in itself, only interpretations. In the 20th century, postmodern thinkers build on these ideas. Foucault showed that what is considered true is inseparable, linked to power and social institutions. Lyotard declared the era of grand universal narratives over, leaving us with a plurality of small local perspectives. And with universal narratives, he meant like Christianity, which is like a grand story about what truth is, but also science, which claims to have the truth in their hands. Also, Derrida highlighted that language and meaning can never be fully fixed, but always remain open to a reinterpretation. Throughout history of philosophy, the notion of one objective truth gradually erodes. From Anaximander's apeiron to Nietzsche's perspectivism and postmodernism, the recurring lesson is that truth is dependent on perspective and context. Rather than an absolute foundation, truth appears as a web of interpretations, constantly in motion. All of this can feel rather abstract, so let's take a metaphor for some more clarity. Suppose you want the most true image of your hand. Like, from which angle do you photograph it? And with what kind of camera? Are you gonna do it with your iPhone or a DSLR camera? Or maybe you want to paint it with watercolor paint? Which representation is the most true? A DSLR might seem the most objective because it appears to be the most realistic. But a painting could capture emotion or inner experience way better. The idea of realism also shifts depending on the observer. For someone who is colorblind, the hand looks different. A dog or a cat experiences the hand primarily through smell and touch. And for an ant, the hand might not even register as a hand, but as a vast landscape filling the horizon. This shows that even a simple object like a hand appears in different ways depending on who looks and how. Reality is never simply visible. It is always filtered through perspective. Another example sharpens this point, and in psychology there is this Rubens phase. You can see it either as a vase or two faces looking at each other. Both interpretations are equally true. Our brains constantly decide which figure is foreground and which is background. Perspective literally determines what we see and experience as reality. And even a more powerful illustration comes from an ancient story in the Indian sutras known in Buddhism. And the story goes like this. A group of blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. No one can see the animal as a whole. They're blind. So each feels a different part. One touches the trunk and says, an elephant is a long twisting snake. Another feels an ear and insists, no, it's clearly a fan. A third grabs a sturdy leg and declares, it must be a massive tree trunk. Each experiences only a fragment, but is convinced of their truth. The story shows that what we perceive and understand is often just a piece of the whole, and reality, like the elephant, is always larger and more complex than any single perspective. Our perception of reality is never a direct reflection of how things really are. It is colored by countless factors shaping what we see, how we interpret it, and why it matters to us. People often believe they see the world as it is, but in reality, we perceive only a fraction of the full complexity, and that fraction is always made meaningful from our context, our background, experiences, our values, and the stories around us. And this goes deeper than aesthetic judgments, like whether a painting is beautiful or ugly. Think of political, social, and moral questions, like whether progressivism or conservatism is better, whether Israel is justified for their actions in Gaza, or which policies are more effective, are also perspectives. Even when we appeal to facts, we are creating a perspective on those facts. Assuming an external objective reality is itself a perspective, and conversely, the postmodern claim that no objective reality exists is also a perspective. Ultimately, no single perspective captures the full truth. Each is partially true, and our minds are biased towards one partial truth, because the totality of reality is too complex and too infinite to fully grasp. So if you look online or in this comment section, if this video does well, you'll see people fighting to prove their perspective. They demonize, call each other stupid, debate, or cancel each other just to protect their ego from the uncomfortable fact that their perspective is partially or entirely false. Because our ego is directly tied to our perspective. It's part of our perspective, or our perspective is part of our ego, and we do everything to defend it. So a perspective never reflects the full reality, but provides a specific lens through which part of the truth becomes visible. Each perspective reveals something while concealing something else. From an integral point of view, this teaches us that to understand reality better, we must recognize, examine, and bring perspectives into dialogue, rather than rigidly defending or rigidly rejecting them. Because if we try to decide which single perspective is best, things get very complex very quickly. So when people look at societal issues, their interpretation often vary widely. What one person sees as obvious or morally right, another may completely reject. This raises the question, what determines how we perceive and interpret reality? Why can the same situation feel threatening to one person and liberating to another? The answer lies in a complex mix of factors that color our perception. Each perspective is rooted in a combination of cultural, personal, psychological, societal, and temporal influences. And to give some examples, like first of all, a cultural and social background. Our culture acts like a pair of glasses we put on from a very early age, rarely taking off consciously. And these glasses shape what we see as normal, what we disapprove of, and even which aspects of reality we notice at all. Culture provides values, symbols, and stories that give meaning to the world. Well, in this, upbringing plays a key role, like norms and belief passed down from family shape how we distinguish good from evil. And things like nationality and ethnicity form collective frameworks. Like shared memories of persecution, colonization, or liberation influences how groups perceive their place in the world. Class and economic background also make a fundamental difference. Like growing up in poverty or abundance give completely different references for what is natural or what is unjust. To give you an example, an Orthodox Jewish Israeli often sees Israel's right to exist as self-evident, rooted in centuries of persecution. A secular progressive college or university student may see the same state as a colonial occupying power. The facts are the same, but the cultural lens produces radically different interpretations. And beyond culture, our individual life experiences color our perspectives. Trauma, major life events, and successes influence how we perceive safety, power, and risk. For example, consider debates about immigration and asylum policy. Someone who was a refugee as a child will likely focus on stories of exclusion, injustice, and personal safety. Someone raised in a stable, protected environment, however, without direct experiences of uncertainty or discrimination, might focus more on abstract and structural concerns regarding asylum and migration policy, like economic impact, employment, and integration. Both their personal history shapes whether they attend to practical consequences or personal experiences of risk and exclusion. Then we have current context and time, like where and when something occurs affects interpretation. Historical and political context determine which values dominate. What was once normal may now be taboo, or vice versa. Crises, wars, or elections shift attention and priorities. Not only timing on the large scale, but also personal timing matters. Someone who just became a parent perceives risks and safety different than before they became a parent. So, as an example, in the time after 9/11, the US government introduced the Patriot Act, giving extensive surveillance power in the name of national security. In a society that felt threatened, many accepted and even welcomed these measures. Today, however, in a relatively stable period, many Americans see the same measures as excessive infringements on individual freedoms. And then we have motives and interests. Interests, fears, and desires guide our attention and determine which facts convince us. And then we have motives and interests. Like motives, interests, fears, and desires guide our attention and determine which facts convince us. Economic, social, or existential interests color how we interpret information. For example, a climate activist sees CO2 data as urgent evidence for action. A livestock farmer, however, sees the same data primarily as a threat to income and livelihood. Both are examining the same facts, but their interests shape the conclusions they draw. This does not make either one wrong. It shows how interpretation is partly driven by motives and concerns. And then another important factor shaping our perception is the social identity categories to which we belong. Think of gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, etc., etc. These categories intersect and form our unique position in society, and this is often referred to as intersectionality. And some resist to the term intersectionality because it is linked to like some political movements or to the idea that identity determines everything. And at its core, intersectionality is an analytical tool. It shows how factors like class, gender, and ethnicity interact to shape how someone experiences society. It is not about putting people in boxes or competing at the Victim Olympics, but about understanding why the same situation affects different people differently. For example, a black man and a black woman share race as a factor, but their experiences differ due to gender. The man may face more police profiling and harsher sentencing, while the woman may face sexism combined with racism, for instance in workplaces or healthcare. The intersection of race and gender creates unique challenges for each of them. So, our perception of reality is never objective or universal. It is always a selection shaped by cultural frameworks, personal history, psychological development, temporal context, interest, and identities. And these factors determine what we see, how we interpret it, and why it matters to us. This explains why the same event can feel liberating to one person while threatening to another. Each perspective is internally coherent but different because it's rooted in a distinct framework. Humility in judgment is crucial, as is actively bringing perspectives into dialogue to achieve a richer synthesis of understanding and action. So when we lay perspectives side by side, we notice that they often clash. It seems as one view cannot be true at the same time as another. If Israel is a safe homeland for threatened people, can it simultaneously be a colonial occupying power? If climate measures are necessary to safeguard the planet's survival, can they at the same time threaten people's livelihoods? Yeah. These apparent contradictions are not accidental. They point to fundamental mechanisms in how we experience and structure reality. To understand this, we need to distinguish several dimensions in which perspectives appear to exclude one another. And first of all is that perspectives highlight different facts. A perspective is like a flashlight in a dark room. It illuminates certain details while leaving the rest in the shadow. Two people can look at the same object but highlight completely different aspects. As a result, it can seem as if they are talking about two different things. For example, in a migration debate, one side points to data showing that immigration boosts economic growth, while the other emphasizes the pressure on housing. Both are correct within their own beam of light, their own framework, but because the flashlight shines on different spots, their conclusions appear to contradict each other. Each claims to hold objective truth by backing it with facts, but in reality, they're cherry-picking data points from reality to protect their own perspective. From an integral viewpoint, where all perspectives are integrated into one meta-perspective, we see a subtle dynamic. Each perspective reveals only part of reality, but looking at multiple perspectives, that creates a richer, more holistic picture. And this requires awareness and also discipline to avoid the myth of the one true perspective. And then we have that perspectives operate with different values and contexts. Facts alone rarely determine our judgment. What we care about and what values we prioritize makes a difference. It's like two people listening to the same piece of music. One focuses on the melody and the other one on the lyrics. They listen to the same whole but assign meaning to different layers, making their experiences fundamentally different. So, the recent discussions and changes in society around gender and sexuality illustrate this well. Like legal recognition of same-sex marriages, debates about trans women, and evolving understandings of the nuclear family all reflect shifts in values. Progressives see these as achievements, steps toward greater freedom and equality. Conservatives, however, who aim to preserve societal structures and traditions deemed time-tested and functional, may see these changes as threatening or disruptive. Both value systems are coherent in themselves, but because they prioritize different aspects, each may perceive the other as wrong. And then a third is that reality is dynamic. Truth is not a static snapshot we can capture once and for all. It is a moving process. Our knowledge, context, and even values change over time. What is considered true at one moment or in one historical phase can later be revised, not necessarily because the first perspective was wrong, but because new insights, facts, and perspectives emerge. Like only a few decades ago, psychiatry classifies homosexuality as a disorder. From the perspective of a society 100 years ago, this made a certain sense. Survival was harder, and the nuclear family, a father, mother, and children, was essential for gathering food, having safety, and social continuity. Sexual relationships outside of this structure were seen as not functional and threatening the survival of the community. Homosexuality fell outside of what was considered functional. Today, in modern societies, where basic survival is largely guaranteed and people have more freedom to explore relationships and sexuality outside of traditional frameworks, many countries recognize equal rights for LGBTQ plus individuals as a fundamental part of human dignity. What was once labeled deviant is now recognized as a right that must be protected. The truth about what is acceptable or morally right shifts with societal context. And of course, this shift is not linear. Like many people remain anchored in older frameworks and beliefs. And often it is about generational differences. Older generations hold on to what they were taught, while younger generations grow up in a world where different values are taken for granted. Change unfolds slowly, generation by generation. Perspectives seem to contradict each other because they illuminate reality from different angles. They select different facts, emphasize different values, reveal different layers, and are often defended with quite some intensity. So, why is it that people defend their perspectives so fiercely? Perspectives clash not only because people hold different facts, values, or interpretations. Often there is a deeper layer, and I touched a little bit on it before, and it is that people identify with their perspective. Their perspective is them and they're their perspective. Because the whole reality of what you perceive is basically you, it's your perspective. And a position is then not just an idea you can swap out casually, but part of your identity, of your sense of security, and even of your loyalty to a group. When somebody questions your perspective, that often feels like a personal attack. And this has psychological and evolutionary roots. The ego, the self-image, or the story you tell about yourself, weaves memories, social roles, and your moral compass into one coherent I. The ego reflexively defends that coherence. Criticism of a conviction, therefore, feels like a threat to the self. And evolutionarily, this makes sense. In earlier human groups, social exclusion often meant loss of food, psychological safety, and reproductive opportunities. Our brain registers social threat much the same way as it registers physical pain. That is why an attack on your belief can instinctively feel like an existential threat. And how does this work? Well, People do not adopt beliefs as isolated facts. Those beliefs become part of their identity, the narrative they tell about themselves. When a narrative is being attacked, it often feels like an attack on the self. Think of someone who sees themselves as rational, honest, and very well informed. Criticism of a political stance then becomes not an abstract disagreement, but a loss of face for who that person believes they are. To keep that self-image intact, we unconsciously deploy several strategies. And one is called motivated reasoning. We scan the world for information that informs our beliefs and ignores or minimizes what does not fit in them. And when new evidence collides with long-held convictions, cognitive dissonance appears. And the tension is uncomfortable. And to reduce it, we rationalize or even deny the new information, like that study was bought or those figures are out of context. And that is often easier than revising your entire self-image. And when the sense of threat increases, it becomes easier to reduce the other to a label, like those woke people, those populists, or those naive activists. Empathy then decreases and debate escalates. This mechanism operates across many situations. Someone who refuses vaccination on principle experiences criticism not as a factual discussion, but as an attack on autonomy and personal identity. A coal miner who fears losing his job because of climate policy does not merely see climate activists as ideological opponents, but as an existential threat to his livelihood. His denial or his hostility is then understandable. And for a believer, the claim that religion is just a cultural construct or just a fairy tale can feel like an assault on their sense of meaning, community, and moral orientation. Here, the conflict is not primarily about facts, but about existential security. At the pro-Israeli side, you can see that cognitive dissonance. That position becomes harder to defend when, for example, a recent UN report indicates signs of genocide in the conduct of Israel in Gaza. The existential fear that an Israeli Jew feels after hundreds of years of prosecution is real. Wanting to protect yourself, your country, and your people is legitimate. But when attempts to protect escalate into actions that amount to genocide, a range of human reactions follows. Some people double down even harder, insisting the measures are necessary, whatever the costs. And others move into denial because they can hardly bear it. Like, how can my feeling and fear and need for protection be legitimate? And at the same time, the way my country responds be so unethical, even inhuman. But there are also people who can sit with that tension. They can look in the mirror and say, yes, my existential fear is real and deserves recognition. And at the same time, Netanyahu, who claims to protect us, is a war criminal responsible for the atrocities in Gaza. And on the other side, you see the same pattern. People who preoccupy themselves with the Palestinian cause focus on the oppression and immense suffering Palestinians have endured at Israel's hands. A fully legitimate perspective. But then the question arises, how do you place Hamas in this narrative? On 7 October, Hamas brutally murdered more than 1,200 people, including cases of rape. And their manifesto calls for the destruction of the state they oppose. How does that relate to the role of Israel? Does Hamas's brutality morally exonerate the state you identify as the ultimate wrongdoer? Here too, people deploy the same strategies. Some double down on their perspectives, like they say Israel caused this, so such a movement is understandable. And there's also like a kernel of truth in that. But others go further and claim Israel deserved it. A stance that raises difficult ethical questions. Others enter denial, omitting certain facts and romanticizing Hamas as freedom fighters Or alternatively, people face the complexity. They acknowledge Palestinian suffering and also recognize that Hamas is a terrorist organization that, like Netanyahu's policies, poison the conflict. You can also see this vividly in the statements of the British rap group Bob Dylan. Like he screamed death, death to the IDF. For many Israelis, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, is the institution that has protected their families for decades against wars and attacks. For Bob Dylan, the IDF is the executor of the genocide in Gaza. This example sharply illustrates how the same phenomenon, the IDF, can be experienced and interpreted in radically different ways. So, this mechanism explains why rational arguments often have little effect in heated debates. People are defending not primarily an isolated truth, but their identity, psychological security, and social survival. So, dealing effectively with clashing perspectives require not only better facts, but also empathy and tact. Recognize which fundamental need is being touched in the other person and create a safe space where they do not reflexively raise their shell. Also, first name the emotion or the loss that the other person is feeling, and also avoid immediate positional framing. Look for shared values. And finally, introduce information step by step so the other is less likely to go into defensive mode. So far, we've mostly spoken about perspectives on reality, but is there actually a reality that exists apart from all those perspectives? Does an objective, independent reality exist? And if so, can we ever truly know it? Or are we always inevitably looking through a lens of our own? Well, our everyday common sense says, yes, there is an external reality. The chair you're sitting on continues to exist even when you leave the room. A tree falls in the forest, even if no one is there to witness it. And science is largely built on this assumption. The world has a structure we can investigate, discover, and describe. But even if such a world exists, we never encounter it as it is. Everything we perceive comes through a filter, our senses, a language, and our concepts. A cat, a bee, or a bat encounters the same world in utterly different ways. Even among humans, perceptions differ. Think of colorblindness, cultural codes, or our personal memories. We never grasp reality raw. We always construct a filtered image. So the question of whether reality exists apart from our perspectives is one of the central debates in Western philosophy. And in this Western tradition, the tension between realism and idealism has shaped thought for centuries. So realism holds that a world exists independently of our perceptions, ideas, or language. The world is just there, like the tree that falls in the forest, regardless of whether anyone sees it. Idealism, by contrast, argues that reality is never separate from consciousness or thought. What we call the world is always mediated by perception, concepts, and interpretation. For idealists, there is no completely independent reality we can know. Our knowledge is inseparably bound to the structures of mind and experience. In short, realism stresses the independent existence of the world, while idealism emphasizes our inevitable involvement in shaping how that world appears. Immanuel Kant, a very famous philosopher from the 18th century, tried to chart a middle path in this. He argued that there is indeed a reality beyond this, what he calls the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself, but we never have direct access to it. What we know are phenomena, the world as it appears through the lens of space, time, and the categories in our mind. His lesson is one of epistemic humility. No one can see the whole. But then we have George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, another philosopher from the 19th century, and he found this too restrictive. For him, thought and reality are not separate domains. Reality itself unfolds historically and dialectically. He says that clashing perspectives are sublated, aufgehoben, into a richer, higher order truth. Truth, then, is not a fixed thing, but a process, a living movement in which contradictions themselves reveal deeper reality. Later, postmodern thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida went further into questioning objectivity. For them, truth is never neutral, but always embedded in power relations, institutions, and language. So what we call reality is always a construct in our mind. Where the Western philosophical tradition often frames the issue as, is there a reality outside us, realism, versus is reality inseparable, tied to our consciousness, idealism, many Eastern traditions reframe the question. They don't see reality as fixed or as separate, but as relational, infinitely multifaceted, and never fully capturable by any single perspective. The central question becomes less whether an external reality exists and more how it reveals itself in interdependence. For example, Nagarjuna, a major Buddhist philosopher, argued that no phenomenon has a fixed, self-existing essence. This is the doctrine of sunyata, emptiness. Things only exist in dependence on causes, conditions, and perception. For example, a table seems a solid thing, but it depends on wood, carpentry, space, and the use of it. Remove those conditions and table disappears. Similarly, the self is not a fixed essence, but a web of body, memory, relationships, and experiences. And for Buddhists, this insight is liberating. Recognizing that nothing exists independently loosens our clinging and reveals the deep interconnectedness of everything. And then we have Taoist philosophy, and that emphasizes that ultimate reality, the Tao as they call it, cannot be fully expressed in words or captured in concepts. Everything flows from the Tao, yet the Tao itself is elusive, manifesting only through change and transformation. And water is a central Taoist metaphor. It flows downward, takes the shape of whatever it encounters, is soft yet wears down stone, and reality, like water, is fluid and ever-shifting. Try to grasp it and it slips away. The Tao is known in movement, never as a static object. So across traditions, the answer on the question whether there is an objective reality differs. Kant teaches us humility. Reality exceeds what we know. Hegel stresses development. Contradictions are not the end, but the motor of truth. Postmodern thinkers expose how knowledge is tied to power, and Eastern philosophies remind us that reality is relational, fluid, and beyond fixed categories. The point is not to choose between reality exists interdependently or everything is perspective. The richer view is to see that reality cannot be exhausted by a single frame. Each tradition highlights a facet, and together they give us a layered picture. So reality is neither a static object out there, nor a purely subjective illusion. It is an unfolding movement that reveals itself through many lenses, none of them complete. Which brings us to the next challenge. If no perspective has a monopoly on truth, how should we take moral stances in a world full of clashing visions without collapsing into simplicity on the one hand or paralyzing relativism on the other? The extremes are obvious. Like, on the one hand, there is the relativism, the idea that all perspectives are equal and therefore no truth or direction exists. On the other hand, there is conflict, the belief that only one truth is valid and all other perspectives must be defeated. One crucial step in modern thinking about perspectives comes from postmodernism. Thinkers such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard pointed out that our view of reality is never neutral. What we consider true is always embedded in structures of power, language games, and cultural context. That insight is profoundly valuable. It teaches us that there is no such thing as a purely objective, unconditioned standpoint. Every position, yours, mine, even that of science, is shaped by interest, background, and the spirit of the time. That realization makes us modest. It invites us to relativize our own certainty. But this perspectivism also has a shadow side. If all truths are relative, we lose the ability to correct one another, to distinguish between well-founded and poorly founded claims, and to set moral boundaries to what we want to defend in a social democracy. And that is why postmodernism or perspectivism often feels threatening to those who value order, facts, and progress. And not without reason, because in its radical form, postmodernism or perspectivism leads to moral and epistemic relativism, the idea that every claim is equally valid, regardless the evidence or fact. And critics such as Jordan Peterson often raise this concern. Like, if we treat all structures and truths as socially constructed, we lose orientation. Everything becomes liquid, unstable, and negotiable. And that creates existential anxiety, especially for people who need a sense of stability and coherent moral frameworks. And Peterson's critique resonates with this longing for certainty and order. Still, it is not an either-or. It is possible to recognize that truth is contextual and perspectival without collapsing into anything goes. What this requires is a more mature way of handling complexity, acknowledging that your perspective is not the only one, while also searching for ways to distinguish between stronger and weaker claims. The key then is to see perspectives not as absolute truths, nor as meaningless opinions, but as partial truths. Each perspective highlights an aspect of reality, but never the totality. Clashing perspectives do not have to be simple, right or wrong. They can be complementary. If perspectives are partial truths, the task is to bring them into dialogue, not in the form of a debate where the aim is to defeat the other, but as a dialogue where the goal is to expand mutual understanding and uncover the part of reality the other perceives. But within such a dialogue, how do we avoid falling into absolute perspectivism? That reflux must be resisted, not because we want to return to dogmatic fundamentalism, but because some perspectives consistently dehumanize, deny evidence, or produce systematic harm. These perspectives cannot be treated as equal to those that respect dignity, evidence, and reciprocity. The real question is not simply who is right, but which perspectives contributes to human dignity, knowledge, and just institutions, and which perspectives destroys those very conditions. To avoid arbitrary exclusion, we can analytically test perspectives along three domains: And the first one is ethics. A legitimate public perspective respects the inherent worth of persons and protects fundamental human rights. If a view legitimizes exclusion, dehumanization, or violence, it fails that ethical test. Then we have epistemics. A responsible perspective is open to critical testing. It uses methods that are transparent, self-correcting, and empirically verifiable. Claims that rest on anecdote, circular logic, conspiratorial reasoning, or dogmatic authority lack epistemic legitimacy. And finally, there is pragmatics. Perspectives must be judged by their real-world consequences. Do they predictably lead to greater well-being, safety, and justice, or to violence, institutional breakdown, and human suffering? Intentions matter less than outcome and historical track records. If a perspective fails on all three domains, undermining dignity, rejecting evidence, and producing destructive outcomes, then that perspective is not on the same level than a perspective that passes those three domains. So let's take an extreme example for some clarity. The perspective of Nazism. Well, if we look at it ethically, its core, racial hierarchy, dehumanization, ethnic cleansing that denies equal human dignity. Epistemically, Nazi racial science is rested on propaganda and pseudoscience, close to independent critique. And finally, pragmatically, its historical outcome is catastrophic. We're talking about genocide, systematic oppression, the collapse of democratic institutions. So, as you might have guessed, Nazism is not a legitimate alternative perspective if you compare it, for example, to democratic politics. It is not just another opinion, but a destructive ideology. Yet, this does not mean that we can simply ignore it. When neo-Nazis or extremist movements grow, the task is to investigate why people are drawn to such ideologies, which fears, frustrations, or social conditions make them susceptible to radicalization. Preventive education, inclusive policies, and resilient institutions are essential. The response is not only repression, but also understanding, to cut extremism off at its roots. So, critical distinction is not censorship. It is an epistemic and moral responsibility within the public debate. Modest about our own limits, but clear about minimal standards. A society that can handle pluralism without collapsing into relativism must acknowledge the partial truth in multiple perspectives, but also foster dialogue instead of zero-sum conflict, and set boundaries where dignity, evidence, and justice are fundamentally violated. This is not an easy balance, but it is the only way to do justice both to the complexity of reality and to our need for shared meaning and collective action. So, what does this require from us in the public debate? It calls for a mode of engagement in which social problems are approached integrally, recognizing multiple perspectives, placing them side by side, and integrating them into our understanding and solutions to societal issues. This approach allows us to stay closer to reality while maintaining a functional society with more sustainable solutions to social problems. There are several key principles that make this mode possible. And the first key principle is that we must see the truth as relational and dynamic. In societal discussions, truth is not a static possession, but a dynamic process. It arises in relation through the interaction of perspectives that complement, challenge, but also correct each other. Truth is therefore not something that one party holds, but something that grows through dialogue and collective exploration. As Friedrich Hegel said, truth is dialectical. An idea or perspective presents one side of reality, the thesis. Opposed to it is a contrasting perspective, the antithesis. In their clash, both contain part of the truth but are also limited. Only in the synthesis, a new level integrating both, does a richer, more complete truth emerge. And to give you a concrete example, the thesis could be scientific facts about CO2 emissions and the climate crisis. The antithesis is social and economic effects of climate policy on farmers or workers or other vulnerable groups. And then the synthesis will be climate policy that respects ecological limits and is socially just. And then a second key principle is that we go from struggle to common orientation. In an increasingly diverse society, the idea that there is only one truth almost inevitably leads to conflict. But the pitfall of everything is relative can paralyze us just as much. The challenge is to use clashing perspectives as raw material for a richer collective narrative. This requires a culture where the goal is not to defeat the other, but to find a broader horizon together. Hegel saw conflict not as an endpoint, but as fuel for development. Clashing perspectives, the thesis and the antithesis, are not disasters, but necessary fuel for growth towards a broader synthesis. Conflict is thus not a duel to the death, but a dialectical moment enabling richer understanding. Truth emerges through the conversation, not before it. So an application to contemporary dialogue would be like regarding immigration. Hereby seems that safety and humanity are often values in conflict. And instead of choosing one, like strict border control, or the other, open borders, both can inform policies and reconcile security and human dignity. Regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict, solidarity with the Jews and with the Palestinians seem mutually exclusive, but a dialogue that acknowledges both perspectives can lay the foundation for justice beyond the victimhood of any single group. A third key principle is that critical differentiation remains necessary. Not all perspectives are equally fruitful in the context of the democracy we live in the West. Public dialogue must allow plurality, but also critical scrutiny. Conspiracy theories, denying scientific evidence, or ideologies that systematically exclude groups do not contribute to a productive collective horizon. The art is to listen to what does reveal truth, while setting boundaries where perspectives undermine shared reality. Freedom of speech means everyone can speak, but does not mean every perspective has equal weight in public decision making. Racist or scientifically disproven claims require critical dismantling, not equal airtime. At the same time, labels as racist or fascist are sometimes misused to suppress certain voices. That's the other side of the story. So, for example, regarding climate skepticism, someone who says, "I don't believe in climate change," can be factually refuted, but this perspective may stem from deeper fears of economic insecurity. That underlying concern should be acknowledged and addressed. Regarding the migration debate, racist rhetoric like "they don't belong here" or "we must deport them" must be confronted, while legitimate concerns about housing, cultural change, or social cohesion can be integrated into policy and dialogue. And then the fourth key principle is a mature engagement with conflict. Conflicts will never disappear. They are inherent to a multicultural, pluralistic society full of clashing perspectives. But we can choose how to engage with them. Rather than seeing conflict as a threat, we can view it as an opportunity, a space where differences become visible and truth can deepen. This requires a different mindset, though, investigating rather than reflexively defending. Take, for example, racism and policing in the United States. Conservative white Americans may view law enforcement as necessary for maintaining public order, safety, and community stability. Criticism of policing can feel like a personal attack on their values of safety and order, their trust in institutions, or their sense of civic responsibility. African Americans, however, experience policing as a source of a systematic discrimination, disproportionate violence, and historical injustice. For them, those critiques are not abstract but tied to lived experiences of inequality and threat. So what you see here are two radically different perspectives on the same phenomenon. And the conflict is so intense because it touches on identity, safety, and recognition. For African Americans, the question is like, are we treated as full citizens with equal rights and dignity? For white Americans, the problem is, are we being unfairly criticized or labeled as racist while trying to uphold law and order? So what we see here are two radically different perspectives on the same phenomenon. This debate illustrates the following things. Conflict is inevitable in a diverse society, that underlying layers are crucial: identity, recognition, historical injustice, safety, and trust in institutions. Also that conflicts can be productive. They force society to confront systemic racism and consider reforms to policing, education, and justice. And finally, that polarization is the danger. Treating the other side as enemies prevents dialogue and collective solutions. In the end, we see that regarding the policing and racism, the understanding deepens the more voices are being heard. A mature stance towards this conflict would be to investigate rather than to defend, exploring underlying fears, values, and historical context. Also to recognize there are kernels of truth on both sides, concerning about public safety and order versus the need for equality and justice. And to provide direction, develop reforms and policies that respect safety, protect rights, and acknowledge historical inequities. And then the final key principle is direction without absolutism. Society cannot function without shared points of orientation. We must make decisions, act, and draw boundaries. This cannot be based on a single absolute perspective, nor by equating all perspectives. It requires guidance that is modest and testable. Choices are made, but remain open to learning and revising. Like in the migration debate, policy decisions cannot endlessly debate whether migration is good or bad. Policy decisions cannot endlessly debate whether migration is good or bad. Policies must be evidence-based, adaptive, and responsive to societal realities. So the final thing that I want to say is that our approach to truth and conflict fundamentally changes once we recognize that perspectives are always limited and colored, yet contain partial truths. Truth is no longer a static possession of one party. It arises relationally, dynamically, and through interaction with experiences, context, and other perspectives. Conflict is inevitable, but it can be fruitful when we learn to see and integrate the underlying layers of identity, values, and interests. Nowadays, in the West, in Europe, in America, in Australia, etc., we are at a turning point. Globalization, migration, digital media, and social mobility have increased diversity, but also polarization. Old modes of consensus and assumed shared norms no longer suffice. Traditional ideas of a single shared truth or uniform values no longer work. The old societal model, in which one dominant culture sets the standard, is no longer viable. What is needed is a transition to an integral society where pluralism is not a problem to solve, but a core condition for resilience and wisdom. Such a society has several key features: recognizing of multiple perspectives. Every group, community, and individual has a unique lens on reality, and these partial truths together provide a fuller picture. But also dialogue over conflict. Clashing perspectives are not about defeating one another, but about examining, connecting, and integrating. Public debate becomes a space to understand and utilize difference without undermining justice. Also, critical differentiation. Pluralism does not mean everything is equal. Societies must separate fertile from destructive perspectives, those that support human dignity, social cohesion, and institutions are central. Destructive ideologies and disinformation are constrained, and also flexible guidance. Decisions and policies are testable and adaptive. Action is based on the best available knowledge, but insights, contexts, and values can shift. This ensures robust and resilient governance. And then we have empathy and recognition of identity. Human needs for acknowledgement and meaning are taken seriously. Debate and policy account for emotional and psychological layers of conflict. Only then can pluralism function sustainably. In concrete terms, the West must build a society that embraces pluralism without collapsing into paralyzing relativism, while remaining strong enough to maintain moral and institutional frameworks. This requires leadership, education, and media that teach citizens to navigate complexity, uncertainty, and diversity. We face a turning point where all dualities of black and white thinking and winner-loser mentalities must be transcended. Society can function as a resilient network for partial truths, where conflict is not feared but used as fuel for growth, and shared points of orientation guide us without suppressing the richness of difference. In short, the future demands a mature engagement with pluralism. And by pluralism, I mean truly plural. People of all ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, and political positions. An approach that combines openness, critical differentiation, empathy, and adaptive guidance. This is not another utopia, but a necessary step forward in a society where difference does not lead to fracture, but to a richer, shared horizon of freedom, justice, and human dignity. Thank you for listening. This was today's episode. If you liked it, like, subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments what you think. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you hit that follow button and give me 5 stars if you want, of course. And see you next time.